Good morning, everybody. I'm Syed Mukibur Rahman, working as a research person academic at the National Translation Mission. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Lakshminarayan Aurora, retired professor of Kannada and Translation in the University of Mysore. He was also the director of Prasagana, University of Mysore. He has been an author and a distinguished translator for the past over 5 decades. Besides being an author and a researcher, he engaged himself in translating from and into English, Kannada, Hindi, and Sanskrit. He has more than 25 books to his credit, including original and translated works. He has been working with various universities and a number of institutions like Sahitya Academy, National Book Trust, Central Institute of Indian Languages, National Translation Mission, National Testing Service, Administrative Training Institute, JSS institutions, Commission for Scientific and Technical Terminology, Karnataka Sahitya Academy, Kwempu Bhasa Bharati, Department of Kannada and Culture of the Karnataka government, etc. Professor Arora was also a member of the academic committee of the Commission of Scientific and Technical Terminology, Government of India. His involvement with NTM translation training since the beginning. Now I invite Professor Ellen Arora to deliver a lecture about principles of translation. Thank you.
Very good mornings to all my friends and colleagues who have been a part of this workshop being conducted under the auspices of the National Translation Mission. Friends, as a part of an introduction to translation, I would be dealing with the principles of translation. Before entering into the principles of translation, I would like to introduce some of the basic words pertaining to the field of elementary translation. At the outset, I consider it my privilege to thank the director and all the officers of the National Translation Mission and the Central Institute of Indian Languages for having offered to me a great opportunity to be with you in this workshop. Friends, translation is very much well known to each of you. Generally, by translation, we mean transference of sense and meaning, or carrying across sense and meaning from one language into another language. Naturally, we require two languages in this situation, but there are instances where the process of translation goes with a single language also. Translating material pertaining to various periods of a particular language, old language, medieval language, modern language, that also comes under translation. But generally, we take two different languages from the point of view of our studies. We have got different words for translation. translation, version, rendering, anuvad, tarjuma, are some of the words which are generally used by us when we make use of English, Hindi, or Urdu, or any of our languages. But the word translation is more popular. Though version and rendering we make use of in some particular context, and anuvad is the general word that is used in Hindi and North Indian languages, and in some of our southern Indian languages, we make use of the word bhashantara for translation. Tarjuma is the Persian, Arabic, Urdu word that is used generally for translation. When I told you that there should be two languages for the purpose of translation, the language from which you would be translating, that is called the source language, and the language into which you would be translating, that is called the target language. Target language is also generally called a receptor language. And we have got terms like lexis, grammar, and context with respect to translation. Lexis generally refers to the vocabulary items or the word items or the nominal and other bases which we make use of in a language. And the grammar is the controlling aspect of a language which makes these words from lexis come together and give out a particular meaning of our choice. And context is something different from lexis and grammar, and meaning is derived on the basis of context or the situation in which we would be making use of a particular usage, particular language. Generally, translation is referred to be a process, and the end product that we get in translation after completing the process of translation, that is also called translation. And a question arises occasionally whether translation is an art or a science. Without much going into the discussion about the artistic or scientific aspect of translation, I would just like to say that the translation is both an art as well as a science. It's a scientific art or an artistic science. Sometimes it is referred to be a craft also. Ernest Stuart Bates, a scholar on translation, says that nothing moves without translation, which shows the necessity or the inevitability of translation in our day-to-day life. As social beings, we have got a lot of give and take in our society. Thereby, communication happens to be a must in our society. And when people do not have the same language to make use of, naturally, they will have to depend on translation. Today we are speaking about nationality, national culture, world citizenship, and so many such other things which would definitely become possible only when we make use of good translations. Friends, I would like to make one more reference that today our whole world is sinking into a global village. Thanks to our science and technology, that today it has been possible to have physical and electronic access to almost every corner of the world. That being, a universal communication becomes necessary, for which different languages, their nature, their limitations, they become impediments. And as such, the inevitability of translation is to be emphasized time and again. Since our independence, we have been, as a nation, trying to make our regional languages, mother tongues, as the medium of instruction. And in this context, a lot of work is being done to translate knowledge texts from English into our Indian languages. Governments, universities, academies, and a lot of institutions, they are engaged in this stupendous task. We have definitely achieved a lot in this direction, thanks to translation. And these days, when we think about the new education policy 2020, National Education Policy 2020, being introduced recently, regional languages and mother tongues have been given a lot of emphasis. So that way, we find that we have to bear much more responsibility in this direction, that we should be able to translate a lot of material into our mother tongues. We have to prepare textbooks, reference books, source books, workbooks for our children who would be studying in schools and colleges. That way, it paves way for different aspects of translation. And before entering into the principles of translation, I would like to quote two stanzas by Samuel Daniel and Rabindranath Tagore, who wrote these stanzas for different purposes, but these stanzas would fit very well to what we have been investigating today, that is translation. The stanzas of Samuel Daniel and Rabindranath Tagore, who wrote these stanzas for their own purposes, but these would fit very well with our translation. Samuel Daniel says, that better world of men whose spirits are of one community, whom neither deserts, oceans, rocks, nor sands can keep from the inter-traffic of the mind. So we have got something like an inter-traffic of the mind. Some processes going in our mind which we would like to share with others, because we are fellow men in a society. Thereby, for this sharing, our spirits, we belong to one community and nothing can interrupt us. Nothing can come in the way, whether be it deserts, oceans, rocks, or sands. And this inter-traffic of the mind continues incessantly. Rabindranath Tagore, he says in his Gitanjali poem 63, "Thou hast made me known to friends whom I knew not. Thou hast given me seats in homes not my own. Thou hast brought the distant near and made a brother of a stranger. Thou hast made me known to friends whom I knew not." जिन्हें मैं नहीं जानता था, ऐसे लोगों से तुमने मेरा रिश्ता जोड़ा. तुम्हारे हृदय में आसरा दिया. जो मेरा आशियाना नहीं था, ऐसी जगह तुमने मुझे जगह दी. जो लोग दूर पर थे, ऐसे लोगों को तुम मेरे पास लाए और एक अजनबी को मेरा भाई बना दिया. I think we can directly take the sense of these things and get it to our translation. Now I would like to tell you about some attributes of translation with respect to a text. Text with respect to translation may be any given material. Maybe a word, maybe an expression, maybe a para, maybe a chapter, or maybe a whole book or a treatise. So all these things could be spoken as a text. And we have got expressions. All that in our mind we would be giving out in the form of expressions to communicate to the others. And we have got context. Context is a situation in which a communication takes place. So different contexts may make the same usage of words to communicate differently. So a translator must be extremely careful that he should give importance to text, expression, as well as context. And we have got literary text with us, technical text with us, scientific material, knowledge material, and all these things have to be given due regards before taking anything to translate. And meaning is one of the essential things. And we have got what we call as intrinsic meaning and dynamic meaning. Intrinsic meaning is something, the word which has got by itself, something like a lexical meaning, a dictionary meaning. So that's the intrinsic meaning. But with respect to context and usage, the meaning of a word may change. For example, cap may be a simple word, but in some contexts, cap may be used to stop something, or it may be used in with the meaning of deceiving somebody. That is also possible. And we have got to check the word order in source language as well as the target language. Because grammar and structure of different languages, they have different word orders. And while translating, we should keep in mind about the nature of the target language. We should take information from the source language and then put it into the target language as if the whole material belonged to the target language. And we have got another word called register, which has got a familial or social context. Because with register, the same meaning may be conveyed with different words. We have got this intermediate form in translation because many a time what happens while we translate, there will be shades of structures from the source language which will be filtered into the target language also. The content will have escaped from the source language and will have arrived into the target language. But that will not be entirely absorbed into the target language. In such a situation, we will have an intermediate form which will be hanging in between the source language and the target language, which has to be eventually and ultimately turned into the nature of the target language or the language into which we are translating. The other words I would like to introduce are style and clarity, because style is very important in our expressions, especially when it goes with literature. And when it comes to science, not only science but even in literature, we have got to think about clarity. Because unless we are clear, we would not be communicating properly. So, unnecessary ambiguity or lack of clarity in meaning should not be there in your translation. And ultimately, I introduce the cultural aspects, the linguistic and cultural aspects could be seen in idiomatic expressions, and pure cultural aspects could be seen in different types of our folk mores, folk life, or any of our social behavior. So two languages would be sharing different cultures, and a translator must be very much clear, very much he should have all the skill to translate from one culture into another culture. Many a time we feel that translation is a very easy process. After all, something is given in one language and we could straight away put that into another language, provided we know both the languages fairly well. I know English well. I know my mother tongue very well, or any other language fairly well. So nothing should prevent me from translating from one language into another. So that should not be a problem at all. But that's not the fact. Languages and expressions are very slippery in nature. The meaning that we comprehend may not be the right meaning that we require. So a translator must be vigilant and careful that he should go in between lines while translating some material. Just for fancy's sake, I have given these examples which would be amusing to translate. For instance, I once saw a deer riding my bicycle. Is it the deer that was riding my bicycle? Maybe a circus deer. Or could it be like this? When I saw the deer, I was riding my bicycle. While going on my bicycle, I saw a deer. That might have any meaning. We met an English history teacher. Well, is the teacher teaching English history, or the history teacher is an English person? He or she may be an English person also who is teaching history to us. Or our teacher might be teaching English history to us. So meanings could be derived in different ways from a simple sentence, from the same sentence. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. My mind is very strong, my mind is very much willing, but my age does not permit. My physical strength does not permit to do some particular work. That's the meaning of this sentence. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. But incidentally, when this was given for some type of machine translation, it was told that when the translation outcome came out, the meaning was something like this. The whiskey is agreeable, the spirit is willing. The translation was, the whiskey is agreeable, but the meat had gone bad. The whiskey is agreeable, but the meat had gone bad. Say from which place meaning is taken to what level. So while translating physically or through machine, we should be extremely careful. Life depends on the liver. So life depends on the organ that is liver, physical organ, or life depends on the person who lives. Two silkworms had a race and ended in a tie. Two silkworms, definitely they had a race to win the race, but they ended in a tie. What was the result of their going fast? They got themselves ended up, and a tie was made out of these worms. So, friends, these examples are very much amusing, and these are given just to illustrate that translation is not that easy as we take it for granted, that we could translate anything in any way. So we should be extremely careful before entering into any translation. Now, coming to the principles of translation, I would like to refer to a great scholar, Theodore Savary, who gave three simple questions. What does the author say? What does he mean? And how does he say it? In fact, by solving these three questions, a good translation might be accomplished. And these look to be some underlying principles for our translation. What does the author say? Refers to the expression, because thoughts are given in terms of expressions, communication. So expression is one aspect. What does he mean? That's the content. Because many a time our expressions might not mean what they really look like, what they really express like. That might not mean. The meaning might be different from what we say. For example, if there is a very thin person coming, and just to ridicule that person who is very lean and weak, we could say, देखो भीमसेन आ रहे हैं. Or if a pakka liar would be coming, would never have spoken any truth in his life, we might say, Satya Harishchandra pada rahe hain. So what we say might not be the same thing what we mean. So for a translator, he should look into what the author says. He should look into what the author means, and how does he say it that comprises the style of our expression. So this expression, content, and style are the three pillars with which we work in translation. Famous German author Retd, he comes with two maxims. There are two great maxims of translation. Either turn the foreign author into a native author, or induce the reader to go out to the author's foreignness. So while translating from different cultures, what we have to do is, either we have to bring that foreign culture and make it ours, or we should induce our native reader into that author's foreignness. So these are the two ways how we could translate a literary work in general. While discussing about the principles of translation, I would like to quote what is called Theodore Savary's contrastive pairs. Savary, when he examined the nature of translation, or the bulk of translations that were before him, which had come down from centuries, he just observed what could have been the principles of translation that are made use of by different translators. and he made into 6 contrastive pairs. And indirectly, these things give us some thoughts about the principles of translation. I would just read what these contrastive pairs are. A translation must give the words of the original. A translation must give the ideas of the original. The question is whether we should translate giving due regards to the words that are used in the original, or should we take the ideas or sense of the original and translate it into our language? This has been a burning question since centuries. But generally it is accepted that it is not the words that we should give due regards at every instance, but it is the sense that will occupy or that will take more priority over these words. So sense translation is always preferred to word translation. A translation should read like a original work, or a translation should read like a translation. The question is, when we have got a lot of regards to the original work, should our translation read like the original work, or should it have its own features, its own nature, its own faculties as a translation? That's also a major question we face. A translation should reflect the style of the original, or a translation should possess the style of the translator. This is also a very big question, because style is very much important. Style is the man, it is said. So, should we reflect the style of the original when we translate, or should we reserve our own style as a translator in our translations? A translation should read like a contemporary of the original, or a translation may never read as a contemporary of the translator. Suppose you are translating some work from a different century, an old work. Should it have the nature of that original work? Our translation should have the nature of that original work, the language and expressions of that old work, or should we translate into the modern language or the contemporary language? So nothing should be added or deleted from the original. Anything can be added or removed from the original. All these things were happening. These are not the actual principles of translation. These were happening in our old translations. And Savory was wondering how to arrive at principles of translations on the basis of these contrastive pairs. So in translation, nothing should be added or nothing should be deleted from what is there in the original. A translation of verse should be in prose, or a translation of verse should be in verse. Translation of poetry is very much difficult. That's why many people say that instead of losing that flavor of poetry in a verse may be simply translated into a prose. But many other people feel that poesy or the poetic faculties, that's the life of a verse, life of a poem. And if that life is taken away from a poem and translated into simple prose, what's the good of translating poetry at all? Poetry need not be translated at all. So these are some of the expressions, contrastive pairs, which will take us to what we could call as principles of translations. I would refer to J.P. Postgate, another scholar on translation. who gave a very good definition of translation, which would also give us the principles of translation. By translation, we mean such a version as shall before all things make it plain that the translator has grasped the sense of each individual word as used in the original. So a translator should grasp the sense of each individual word as used in the original. So you should read it again, giving importance to each and every word that PostGet has made use of. As selected to render in the nearest equivalent, which the genius of the language permits. So every language will be different from the point of view of its genius, its nature. So we should find nearest equivalents for different words which are in the original, which will be appropriate in the target language. And as so arranged and welded together, those equivalents, that the whole becomes an exact counterpart of the passage, equally careful in diction and equally elegant in style. And ultimately, when we translate, we should have a very good arrangement of words or communicated information in translation, and those equivalents should be welded together, not the word welding, inseparability, welded together, that the whole becomes an exact counterpart of the passage, equally careful in diction and equally elegant in style. So diction should be carried out and elegance should be maintained. When all these things are taken care of, you will be able to get very good translation. Now I would just mention about 5 principles of translation, and these are the principle of fidelity, the principle of the pleasure of the reader, the principle of commensurateness, the principle of compensation, and the principle of originalness. Though we cannot go in detail about these principles, I would like to give some highlights what these principles would mean. Fidelity is faithfulness, and in translation, fidelity occupies the highest place. A translation that is faithful is considered to be the best translation. But the question arises whether you should be faithful to the author, faithful to the work, faithful to your language, faithful to yourself as a translator. All these questions arise. But yet, fidelity or faithfulness should be given due regards. And while translating, maintaining fidelity, some translation could go astray also. Might become something odd. But even the oddity, if fidelity is followed, scholars say you could arrive at a good translation. Principle of the pleasure of the reader means that after all it is for the reader that we have been translating. He is the end user of our translation. So as the original gave pleasure to its readers, so the translation should give similar pleasure to the readers of the target language. So if that pleasure is not maintained, there is no point in reading a translation at all. A translation should also be attractive. That should invite a reader to take it up. Principle of commensurateness means from all aspects, from the point of view of language, from the point of view of style, diction, expression, and from all these aspects, there should be an equal management, commensurateness, carrying over into the target language. So all these aspects which are the attributes of the original language, they should be carefully taken into as a whole into the target language. And the totality of the original should be maintained as the totality of translation. So that will be the principle of commensurateness. And principle of compensation, many a time when we translate, we would be losing much of the flavor of the original work because many nuances cannot be translated, many delicacies cannot be brought into translation. Especially when you get into poetry, you have to simply accept your defeat or dissatisfaction that you would not be able to bring all that which are in the original into your translation. So what is lost there might be compensated here to some extent in your translation carefully. So that way of making up your translation or getting a similar flavor of the original into your translation, making or compensating it. So that is the principle of compensation which has to be carefully used. And we call the last principle as the principle of originalness. When the original is original, the translation should also look like a original work. Because the purpose of translator is to make his work to look as much as the original work. So he does not purport or intend to give a translation which is far away from the original work. So this originalness should be maintained as far as possible in translation also. That way, these are the 5 different principles which we generally speak about the translation. A lot of things go into each and every of these principles, and to be very much brief, we could just mention these principles, and it would not be possible it would not be possible to deal with each and every principle at this hour. So friends, I am extremely happy that I was able to give some elements and introduce what translation is. Translation has to be carried out according to these principles. But many a time, translation is considered to be a no man's area. Well said. So translation, when we take it as a whole, that is considered to be a no man's area also. Because we do not study translation, at least we were not studying translation earlier, say 50, 60 years back, as a matter of discipline, as a subject for a diploma or degree, long back. So that way, translation was almost no man's area. It was for a hobby that a translation was taken up. It was a passion. But today things are changing. Translation has got its own status. It is considered to be a discipline in our schools and colleges and universities. That way, these principles have to be given due regards. Thank you very much. Namaste.